Margaret Ashford sat on a metal bench outside the house she had lived in for 31 years, holding a suitcase in one hand and a wooden jewelry box in the other. The April wind cut through her thin cardigan. Behind her, through the window she used to open every morning to let the spring air in, she could hear Richard laughing. A silver Audi she had never seen before pulled into the driveway. Her driveway. And a woman half her age stepped out carrying grocery bags. The woman glanced at Margaret the way you glance at a stranger sitting too close to your property. Not with cruelty, with nothing. Margaret Ashford, 63 years old, had just become invisible in front of her own home. And she had no idea that the only thing she had left, a battered box of what everyone called junk, was about to tear open a secret that would shake an entire industry, destroy her husband's plans, and resurrect a name the world had tried to bury for 40 years. If this story satisfies your soul the way it satisfies mine, drop the word ROSE in the comments and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what Margaret finds inside that box. She hadn't seen it coming. That was the part that kept turning in her mind like a wheel with no grip. She hadn't seen any of it coming. Richard had been planning for over a year. She would learn this later, in pieces, the way you learn the full shape of a disaster only after the water has receded. But on that bench, she knew almost nothing. She only knew that this morning she had been a wife, a mother, a woman with an address and a name that meant something. And now she was sitting outside with a suitcase that didn't even have a working zipper. It started 3 weeks ago, or at least that was when the surface cracked. Richard came home with a folder and a tone she had never heard before. Flat, rehearsed. He sat at the kitchen table and told her he wanted a divorce. No argument, no build-up, no fight over dinner. Just a man reading from a script he had clearly practiced in someone else's office. He had already filed, he had already moved money. The house, which was in his name, she remembered him explaining years ago why that was simpler, just for taxes, sweetheart, would remain his. The retirement account she had never been given access to was, according to his attorney, not subject to equal division due to a prenuptial clause Margaret barely remembered signing at 26. She had been 26. She had signed whatever he asked because she loved him, and because love at 26 doesn't read the fine print. What broke her faster than the money was the children. David, their son, 34, called 2 days after Richard's announcement and spoke to her in a voice she didn't recognize. Cold, distant. He said he didn't want to take sides, but then took one anyway. Claire, their daughter, 31, didn't call at all. Margaret later found out that Richard had been telling them both for months that she had become unstable, that she had been spending recklessly, that she had threatened him. None of it was true. But Richard told the story first, and the story stuck. The morning she left, Richard stood in the hallway and watched her pack. She moved through the bedroom like a ghost in her own life, folding blouses, taking photographs from drawers, the ones he didn't want. When she reached for her mother's jewelry box on the dresser, he almost smiled. "Take it," he said. "Take your little box of costume junk." He said it the way you talk about something that confirms everything you already believe about a person. That she was sentimental, impractical, soft. That she clung to worthless things because she herself had no value. Margaret took the box. She didn't answer him. She walked out the front door with the suitcase in one hand and the box pressed against her ribs with the other, and she heard the door close behind her before she reached the sidewalk. She drove to a Motel 6 off the interstate because it was the only place she could afford. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. She sat on the edge of the bed and counted her money. $340. A debit card linked to an account Richard had likely already drained. A phone with 11% battery. And the box. She placed it on the nightstand and stared at it. Wooden, dark, scuffed at the corners. Her mother, Rose, had kept it on her vanity for as long as Margaret could remember, through apartments and rented rooms, through years of quiet struggle. Rose died when Margaret was 14. Heart failure, the doctor said, though Margaret always believed it was something slower and sadder than that. Something that had been pressing on her mother's chest for years before her heart finally agreed to stop. Margaret ran her fingers along the lid. Inside were the same things that had always been inside. A string of glass beads, 2 brooches with cloudy stones, a thin bracelet, and a ring with a setting that had lost its shine decades ago. She touched each piece, one by one, the way you touch relics from a world that no longer exists. She didn't open the false bottom that night. She didn't even know it was there. She just held the box against her chest, lay down on the motel bed without pulling back the covers, and cried until she fell asleep. She woke up before dawn with her shoes still on, and the jewelry box pressed into the mattress beside her. The room was dark, except for the red glow of the motel clock. 4:47 a.m. For a few seconds, she didn't remember where she was. Then it came back in one wave. Richard's flat voice, the folder on the table, Claire's silence, the silver Audi in the driveway. She sat up slowly, feeling every ear in her spine. The box had shifted during the night and was resting at an angle against the pillow. Margaret picked it up and placed it on her lap. She opened it the way she always did, gently, with both hands, and looked at her mother's things. The glass beads caught what little light there was. The 2 brooches sat side by side, dull and familiar. She lifted the bracelet and turned it in her fingers, remembering how it looked on her mother's wrist. Rose had thin wrists and long fingers, hands that were always making something, always moving. Margaret had once asked her, when she was maybe 9 or 10, why she wore jewelry that wasn't real. Rose had looked at her with an expression Margaret couldn't read at the time, smiled and said, "Who told you it wasn't real?" She had never understood that answer. She still didn't. But this morning, sitting in a motel room with nothing left, she held the bracelet tighter than she ever had and whispered, "I don't know what to do, Mom." That was when she noticed it. The velvet lining on the bottom of the box had always been slightly uneven. She had known this her whole life, had run her fingers over it hundreds of times, but she had never questioned it. Now, with the box tilted on her knees and the early light hitting it from the side, she saw that one corner of the lining was not just uneven. It was lifted. A tiny edge, no more than a centimeter, curling away from the wood beneath. Margaret set the jewelry on the bed and turned the box over. She pressed the bottom with her thumb. It gave slightly. Not the way solid wood gives, but the way something with a cavity behind it gives. Her pulse changed. She didn't know why yet, but something in her body understood before her mind did. She found the edge of the velvet with her fingernail and pulled. The fabric peeled back slowly, revealing a thin wooden panel fitted so precisely into the base of the box that it could have passed for the bottom itself. There was a tiny brass latch, no bigger than a shirt button, recessed into the wood. She pressed it. The panel popped up half an inch. Beneath it, in a space barely 2 centimeters deep, were 3 things. A sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, with her name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. A small brass key, tarnished almost black, with a number etched into its head, 7019. And a leather notebook, no larger than a passport, its cover cracked and soft with age. Margaret's hands were shaking. She picked up the envelope first. The paper was thick, the kind that doesn't exist anymore. She opened it carefully, pulling out 2 folded pages covered in Rose's precise, slanted script. The letter was dated June 3rd, 1979, 5 months before Rose died. It began, "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means life has finally brought you to the place where you need the truth. I am sorry I could not give it to you while I was alive. I was afraid, not of the truth itself, but of what it would cost you to carry it before you were strong enough. I believe you are strong enough now. I have to believe that." Margaret read the next lines 3 times before they arranged themselves into something she could accept. Rose wrote that for 11 years, from 1962 to 1973, she had been the lead designer for a jewelry house in Paris called Beaumont and Châtain. She had created every piece in their most celebrated collections. The ones that made the house famous, the ones that were still referenced in design schools decades later. She had done all of it under a name that was not her own, Marcel Renard. A man's name, invented by the house's director, Claude Beaumont, because he said the world was not ready to buy beauty from a woman's hand. Rose wrote that she had accepted this at first. She was young, she was talented, she was desperate to work. But as the years went on, and the collection she created made millions, she received almost nothing. When she asked for credit, just her name, not even money, Claude Beaumont terminated her contract, confiscated her workspace, and told her that Marcel Renard was the property of the house, that she had signed away her identity, that if she spoke publicly, they would deny everything and bury her in legal costs she could never afford. Rose left Paris in 1973 with nothing but her daughter, her sketches, and the jewelry she had made with her own hands. The prototypes Claude never knew she kept, because he thought they were cheap replicas. He never looked closely enough. No one ever did. The letter ended with an instruction. The key opens box 7019 at First Federal Savings in Boston. Everything I could not say is there. Take it, Margaret. Take back what they stole from me. And if you can, let them hear my real name. Margaret set the letter down on the bed. She sat perfectly still for a long time. The motel clock blinked 5:23. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the interstate. She picked up the leather notebook and opened it. Page after page of sketches. Necklaces, earrings, brooches, rings, drawn with a precision and confidence that took her breath away. In the margins, notes in French and English, measurements, stone names, color codes, an entire world her mother had carried in silence. She looked at the brooches on the bed, the ones with the cloudy stones, the ones Richard had called junk. She picked one up and held it to the light from the window. For the first time in her life, she looked at it not as a daughter holding a keepsake, but as a woman holding evidence. Margaret drove to Boston the next morning in a car she wasn't sure would make the trip. The Honda was 16 years old, bought used, and the check engine light had been on for so long she had stopped seeing it. She left the motel at 7, skipped breakfast because she couldn't afford to eat and pay for gas on the same day, and followed the highway north for 3 hours with the jewelry box on the passenger seat beside her, buckled in like a child. She had called First Federal Savings from the motel phone the night before. The bank still existed. That alone felt like a minor miracle. A thread from 1979 still holding. The woman on the phone confirmed that box 7019 was active, paid through 2024 with a 45-year prepaid arrangement. Rose had paid for 45 years. Margaret did the math in her head while she drove. Her mother had set this up on a nurse's aide salary, probably cutting corners Margaret never noticed as a child, probably skipping meals of her own so that a metal box in a basement vault would still be waiting when the day came. Rose had been dead for 40 years, and she was still protecting her daughter. The bank was on Federal Street, in a building that looked like it had been renovated twice since her mother last walked through its doors. Margaret parked 2 blocks away and sat in the car for 10 minutes, holding the brass key. It was warm from her grip. She had not let go of it since she left the motel. The woman at the front desk was polite but careful. Margaret showed her ID, showed the key, explained that her mother had opened the box and that she was the listed successor. There was a pause, the kind that makes your stomach tighten, while the clerk typed and scrolled and typed again. Then she nodded. The records matched. Margaret's name had been on the account since 1979. Rose had listed her as the sole beneficiary before Margaret even started high school. A security guard led her to the basement. The vault room was cold and fluorescent. He pulled the long metal box from the wall, set it on the table, and left her alone. Margaret stood over it for a moment, both hands flat on the surface, and took a breath that reached the bottom of her lungs. She turned the key. Inside, the box was organized with a precision that made Margaret's throat tighten, because she recognized it. She organized things the same way. Neat stacks, labels, everything in its place. Rose had arranged this the way she arranged every drawer, every shelf, every corner of their small apartment. Order as a form of love. On top, a large envelope containing over 60 original design sketches on heavy drafting paper. Each one signed in the bottom right corner, not Marcel Renard, but Rose Ashford, her real name, her real hand. Necklaces that curved like rivers, earrings shaped from forms Margaret recognized from nature, seed pods, ice crystals, the geometry of petals. Each piece was extraordinary. Even Margaret, who knew nothing about jewelry design, could feel the difference between these drawings and anything she had ever seen in a store window. Beneath the sketches, a contract, 12 pages, dated March 1962, between one Marcel Renard and Beaumont and Chatin S.A., Paris. The terms were brutal even to Margaret's untrained eye. All designs produced during the term of engagement became permanent property of the house. No attribution, no residuals. A flat fee per collection that, even adjusted for inflation, amounted to almost nothing. And at the bottom, 2 signatures. Claude Beaumont's confident scrawl, and beside it, in the same precise hand that had written Margaret's letter, the name Marcel Renard. Her mother's ghost signature. The name of a man who never existed, written by a woman the world refused to see. There was more. A bundle of correspondence, letters between Rose and Claude Beaumont spanning 11 years. Early letters were professional, almost warm. He praised her work, called the 1965 collection the finest thing this house has ever produced. But the tone shifted as the years went on. Rose's letters became more direct. She asked for credit, for fair compensation, for acknowledgement. His replies became shorter, colder. The last letter, dated October 1973, was 3 lines long. It informed Monsieur Renard that the working relationship was terminated effective immediately, and that any public disclosure of internal creative processes would result in legal action. He didn't even use her pseudonym in the closing. He wrote, "This matter is settled. Do not contact this house again." At the bottom of the box, Margaret found a small manila folder containing photographs. Black and white, slightly faded. Rose in a workshop, a real Paris atelier, with high windows and long tables covered in tools and molds and sketches. In one photograph, she was bent over a workbench, setting a stone into a silver frame. Her face lit from the side, completely absorbed. In another, she stood beside a display case at what appeared to be a showing. Her designs on velvet stands behind glass, and Rose standing to the side, unnamed, unintroduced, watching strangers admire her work without knowing whose hands had made it. Margaret stared at that photograph for a long time. She understood now. Not just the facts were in the documents, but the feeling, the specific weight of being erased, of standing in a room full of people who are looking at your life's work and don't know your name, of being told that your talent is welcome, but your identity is not. She packed everything back into the box carefully, asked the clerk for a private room, and spent the next hour photographing every document, every sketch, every letter, every photograph with her phone. Then she placed it all back in the vault, locked it, and put the key in her coat pocket. On her way out of the bank, she stopped in the lobby and looked at the brooches she had carried her entire life, the ones now tucked into a cloth pouch inside her purse. She had taken them to a jeweler 2 blocks from the motel the previous evening, just before closing. The man behind the counter had put a loop to the first brooch, gone quiet, put the loop down, and looked at her with an expression she would never forget. "Where did you get this?" he asked. She told him it was her mother's. He picked up the second brooch, examined it, and set it down gently on the velvet pad as if it might bruise. The stones were real. Both pieces were handcrafted originals, museum-grade work, he said. Conservative estimate for the pair? Over $400,000. Richard had laughed when she took them. He had called them junk. And now, Margaret was standing in a bank lobby in Boston with her dead mother's stolen legacy in a vault behind her and a fortune pinned inside a cloth pouch. And for the first time in weeks, she was not afraid. She was furious. She found the attorney the way people find things when they have no connections and no money. She searched on her phone in the motel parking lot until the battery hit 3%. His name was Leonard Pace. He worked out of a small firm in Cambridge that specialized in intellectual property and estate claims. His website said he had spent 20 years handling cases involving artistic credit disputes, stolen design work, and posthumous rights recovery. Margaret called the next morning from the motel landline. The receptionist asked what the case was about. Margaret said, "My mother designed jewelry for Beaumont and Chatin for 11 years under a fake name, and they erased her." There was a pause. Then the receptionist said Mr. Pace could see her Thursday at 2. She drove to Cambridge in the same Honda with the same check engine light. She wore the only clean blouse she had left. She carried a folder of printed photographs from her phone and the original letter from Rose. She had rehearsed what she would say, but when she sat down across from Leonard Pace, a tall man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into grey hair, she didn't use any of it. She just handed him the letter and watched his face while he read. He read it twice. Then he picked up the photographs of the sketches, one by one, holding each one at arm's length, the way people hold things they're not sure they believe. He spent a long time on the contract. He spent even longer on Claude Beaumont's final letter, the 3-line dismissal that ended Rose's career and sealed her silence. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Not softened, sharpened. Like a man who had just realized the file in front of him was not a routine case. "How long has Beaumont and Chatin been operating since your mother left?" he asked. "They're still operating," Margaret said. "They're in department stores. They have boutiques in New York, London, Tokyo." "And the design language, the style your mother created, are they still using it?" "I looked at their website last night," Margaret said. "Their current collection, the shapes, the settings, the way the metalwork curves. It's hers. It's all hers. They've been building on what she made for over 50 years. Pace removed his glasses and set them on the desk. He told her what she had. She had original sketches signed with her mother's real name. She had a contract proving the working relationship existed. She had correspondence proving the house knew Marcel Renard was a fabrication. Claude Beaumont's letters were addressed to Rose by her first name in the early years, before the lawyers sanitized everything. She had photographic evidence of Rose in the atelier, at showings, at her workbench. And she had physical prototypes, handmade originals with real stones, that predated the house's commercial production and could be forensically matched to the collections Beaumont and Chatin had sold for decades. "This is not a thin claim," Pace said. "This is 50 years of unpaid royalties on a design legacy that is still generating revenue. If these documents hold up, and from what I'm seeing they will, your mother wasn't a contributor to Beaumont and Chatin. She was the foundation." He took the case on contingency, no upfront fees. Margaret didn't have to explain why that mattered. He already understood. Within 2 weeks, Pace's team had assembled a preliminary filing. They engaged a forensic handwriting expert who confirmed that the sketches in the vault and the Marcel Renard signature on the contract were written by the same person. They brought in a jewelry historian from the Rhode Island School of Design who examined the 2 brooches and identified design elements that appeared, unchanged, in Beaumont and Chatin's 1965, 1968, and 1971 collections, the 3 most commercially successful lines in the house's history. The historian's written assessment used a phrase that Margaret read 4 times. These are not derivative works. These are the source. The filing was sent to Beaumont and Chatin's legal team in Paris on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Margaret's phone rang. Not the house's lawyers. Richard. He called from the home phone, the number she still knew by heart, but had deleted from her contacts the night he told her to leave. His voice had a texture she recognized instantly. Controlled panic dressed up as casual concern. "Margaret, I've been hearing some things," he said. "Something about your mother's jewelry, some kind of legal situation. I just want to make sure you're okay." He didn't want to make sure she was okay. He wanted to know how much she had found and whether the divorce settlement could be reopened. She understood this not because she had become cynical, but because she had finally stopped pretending. "I'm fine, Richard," she said. Nothing else. 2 days later, David called. Her son, who had not spoken to her in nearly 2 months. Who had told her on the phone in March that he needed space and that she should respect Dad's process. Now his voice was soft, almost sweet, shaped like the boy she used to carry on her hip. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything, and I feel terrible about how things went. I want to see you. Can we get lunch this week?" Margaret closed her eyes. She loved her son. She would always love her son. But she heard the timing in his words like a wrong note in a familiar song. He wasn't calling because he missed her. He was calling because someone had told him the worthless jewelry box might be worth something, and the woman he had abandoned was no longer the woman he expected to find. "David," she said, "I would love to have lunch with you. But not this week. And when we do, I need it to be because you actually want to sit across from your mother, not because someone told you to call." He stammered. She said goodbye and hung up. Then she sat on the edge of the motel bed, the same room, the same red clock on the nightstand, and felt something she had not felt since the day Richard handed her that folder. She felt like herself. Not the version of herself that Richard had built over 37 years. Agreeable, quiet, grateful, small. The real one. The one who had been in there the whole time, pressed flat under the weight of someone else's version of who she was supposed to be. Pace called the following Monday. Beaumont and Chatin's attorneys had responded. They were not denying the claim outright. They were requesting a private meeting. "They don't want this public," Pace said. "They've spent 50 years building a brand on a ghost. If the world finds out who Marcel Renard really was, it doesn't just cost them money. It costs them the entire story they've been telling about themselves." Margaret looked at the photograph of her mother on her phone. Rose in the atelier, bent over her workbench, light on her face, invisible to everyone who walked past the glass. And she thought, that is exactly why the world needs to find out. The meeting took place in New York, in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building Margaret had walked past 100 times in her life, without ever going inside. Pace sat beside her. Across the table, 3 attorneys from Beaumont and Chatin's U.S. legal team, and a woman named Hélène Beaumont, Claude's granddaughter, now the creative director of the house. She was younger than Margaret expected, mid-40s, immaculate blazer, pearl earrings, steady hands. She looked at Margaret the way someone looks at a crack in a wall they've been told is structural. The attorneys spoke first. They used phrases like legacy reconciliation and historical creative ambiguity. They offered a figure, substantial, but structured in a way that would include a permanent non-disclosure agreement. Margaret would be compensated. Rose's name would remain buried. The world would continue to believe that Beaumont and Chatain's golden era was the work of a man named Marcel Renard, and the house would continue to profit from a dead woman's hands without ever saying her name out loud. Pace looked at Margaret. This was her decision. Margaret looked at Hélène Beaumont. "Did you know?" she asked. Hélène didn't answer immediately. She glanced at her attorneys, who shifted in a way that meant don't. But something in her face moved. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when a thing you always suspected is finally standing in front of you, asking a direct question. "There were rumors," Hélène said quietly. "My grandfather never spoke about it. But there were always gaps in the story. Sketchbooks with no author. Design notes in handwriting that didn't match anyone on staff. I asked about it once when I was in school. My father told me not to ask again." Margaret nodded. She understood that kind of silence. She had lived inside a version of it her entire marriage. "I don't want your non-disclosure," Margaret said. "I want her name." The negotiation lasted 4 more weeks. Pace handled the details. Margaret gave him one instruction. The settlement must include full public acknowledgement of Rose Ashford as the creator of the 1962 through 1973 collections. Every piece, every line, every stone setting and metalwork curve that the house had built its empire on. Financial compensation was part of the agreement, a figure large enough to make Pace's paralegal gasp when she typed it. But Margaret barely looked at the number. She had lived on $340 and motel coffee for nearly 2 months. Money had stopped meaning what it used to mean. What mattered was the sentence in the final document that read, "Beaumont and Chatain acknowledges that the collections attributed to Marcel Renard were designed by Rose Ashford and commits to crediting her by name in all future references to this body of work." The news reached the public through a feature in the New York Times. The headline used Rose's name. Margaret read it on her phone in a rented apartment in Cambridge, the first place she had signed a lease for in her own name in 37 years. She read it 3 times, then set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat in the silence that followed. She used a portion of the settlement to establish the Rose Ashford Foundation, a grant program for female designers, jewelers, and artisans whose work had gone uncredited, unrecognized, or unsigned. Applications came in within the first week, hundreds of them. Women in their 20s, women in their 70s, women who had spent decades making beautiful things that carried someone else's name. Margaret read every application herself. Claire called first, not David, Claire, the daughter who had gone silent, who had chosen her father's version of the story without hearing her mother's. She called on a Sunday evening and didn't speak for the first 10 seconds. Then she said, "Mom, I read the article about Grandma Rose. I didn't know. I didn't know any of it." Her voice broke on the last word. Margaret let her cry. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Claire asked if she could come visit. Margaret said yes. David came later. He arrived at her apartment with flowers and the specific stiffness of a man who knows he failed and hasn't yet found the words for it. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had read the Times article, and told her he was sorry. Not for Richard, for himself, for the call he didn't make, for the months he let pass, for believing the version of his mother that was easiest to believe. Margaret listened. She told him she loved him. She told him love was not the thing that had been broken between them. Trust was, and trust would take time. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was new. Richard did not call. Margaret heard through Claire that he had moved in with a woman from the silver Audi and was contesting the revised divorce terms through his attorney. Margaret's lawyer handled it. She didn't think about it more than she had to. Richard had become what he always was beneath the rehearsed speeches and the controlled silences. A man who measured people by what he could take from them. He had looked at Margaret's life and seen things to acquire. He had looked at Rose's jewelry box and seen junk. He had been wrong about both. The Foundation's first exhibition opened in October, in a small gallery in Boston, 3 blocks from the bank where Rose's vault had waited for 40 years. Margaret placed the 2 brooches, the ones she had carried her entire life, the ones Richard had laughed at, in a glass case at the center of the room. Beside them, a photograph of Rose in the Paris atelier. In the picture, Rose was not looking at the camera. She was looking down at her work, her hands steady, her face calm, completely absorbed in the act of making something beautiful that no one would ever know was hers. The plaque beneath the case read, Rose Ashford, designer, 1933 to 1979. Her name was always here. Margaret stood in front of the case for a long time after the guests had gone. The gallery was quiet. The lights above the display made the brooch stones glow the way they must have glowed the day her mother set them. She thought about the bench outside her old house, the suitcase with the broken zipper, the red numbers on the motel clock. She thought about how the worst moment of her life had led her to a false bottom in a wooden box, and the false bottom had led her to the truth, and the truth had led her here, standing in a room full of her mother's work, with her mother's real name on the wall, in a life that was finally and completely her own. Some people leave us money. Some people leave us houses or land or investments that grow while we sleep. Rose Ashford left her daughter a battered jewelry box full of what the world called junk. And inside that junk was a voice that had been waiting half a century to speak. The cruelest thing anyone can do to a person is erase them. The most powerful thing a daughter can do is write them back. If this story reminded you that the things we carry from the people who loved us are never as small as they look, type the word Rose in the comments.